Mr. Speaker, I've been yielded time graciously by my friend, and I'm prepared to use that time.
The gentleman's recognized.
Yield myself such time as I may consume. And again, I thank my friend and colleague, Mr. Woodall, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. I also appreciated his comments about the fact that we are borrowing from the next generation. I gather that the previous generation borrowed from us. I don't know when the borrowing stops, but at least that seems to be the way of the world until we get to a point where we can be self-sustaining as rightly we should be. This rule provides for consideration of commerce, justice, science appropriations for fiscal year 2013. Many of my Republican colleagues have been patting themselves on the back for the open rule associated with this bill. And they claim that this effort demonstrates transparency and their commitment to regular order. Putting aside from the moment, or for the moment, whether a single open rule in 304 days for an open legislation process, the fact is that now the Republicans are using this rule to correct a mistake they made in their previous effort to deem and pass the Ryan budget. It seems, Mr. Speaker, that the deem and pass didn't work the first time around, and it was supposed to break the spending agreement made by my friends in the Republican Party in the Budget Control Act. But they bungled that effort a couple of weeks ago and now have to try to go back on their word. Seems to me that if you're going to break an agreement that you made in good faith, you ought to get it right the first time. Doing this twice just calls attention to what little regard there is for bipartisan cooperation and agreement. And I heard my colleague, Mr. Woodall, comment about this coming out of the subcommittee and the committee by voice vote, and there is no disagreement in that regard. And I guess to some, that is to be a commendable effort. But he also suggested that we may very well, if we were to choose, carry this on voice vote. I would disabuse him of that notion. That is not going to happen. The deem and pass was wrong the first time around, and it's still wrong the second time around, and shouldn't have been placed in here, and it will be wrong the third, fourth, and however many more times around there are, in spite of open rules, if you put it in it, until the Republicans have repudiated every last promise they made. If breaking the Act agreement wasn't enough, the Republican majority is also using this rule to silence members on the upcoming reconciliation legislation being considered by this body later this week. Rather than using regular order, and I stick a tack in that to compliment my colleague on the Rules Committee, who does believe and has made it manifestly clear that he believes in regular order. But rather than using regular order to debate the merits of breaking their promises, Republicans are imposing martial law to prevent members from properly considering the legislation and having their say. Forcing same-day consideration, that's what we mean when we say martial law of the legislation, simply reinforces the majority's intent to use this legislation for partisan gain. Instead of working with Democrats on a bipartisan process, Republicans want to jeopardize funding for essential government programs so they can both go back on their agreements and force the House to consider the legislation sight unseen. This is an unfortunate situation because Democrats would have been pleased to support this open rule Had the Republicans followed regular order, Democrats would support this rule, and I, for one, would argue that we should do so by voice if it had been that way. And if the Budget Committee Democrats end up taking the entire 3 days that they are entitled to under the rules of the House before they finish their views, we could consider the reconciliation bill on Monday instead of Thursday. This is no way to run a budget process and no way to conduct the business of the House. I'd be amused at the Republicans' failed efforts here, Mr. Speaker, except that I'm dismayed to point out that millions of Americans depend on the programs considered under the appropriations process. An agreement was made with the Budget Control Act, and under the agreement, the Republicans promised certain levels of funding for essential programs. That funding is now in jeopardy because the majority wants to spend time trying to go back on what they promised. Let me remind this body that the House and Senate both passed the Budget Control Act. The Senate has not passed the Ryan budget, and deeming and passing does nothing but force this body, as I say all the time, to pretend that the budget as offered is in effect. As I said in the Rules Committee when the Republicans tried to do this the first time around, if we're going to pass legislation that pretends things exist, then I guess we don't need either the Senate or the President of the United States, and so we can just pretend that the laws have passed, when in fact they have not. I don't have my copy of I'm Just a Bill, and my colleague wasn't here when I read it in committee at one point in time, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't mention that the way to pass legislation is to first pass one agreement and then try twice to pretend it never happened. I don't know what that looks like in a cartoon version, but probably less like Schoolhouse Rock and more like Wile E. Coyote falling straight off a cliff. Because if we're going to get out of the business of reality and into the business of pretending, let's just pretend that every American has a job, that every student can go to college, and that no child goes to bed hungry. Let's pretend that the billions we wasted on unnecessary wars were instead actually invested right here in the United States of America. Let's pretend that Thanksgiving is in June and Christmas is in July and the election season is over and the deficit is gone. And since we've now pretended that everything is fine in our great country, let's go tell all of the unemployed, the middle class, the hungry, and the poor that their problems aren't real. Or better yet, let's just pretend those, because that's exactly what I believe the majority's budget does. Rather than using the power of the federal budget to lead this country into a new era of economic growth, Republicans want to cut taxes for those that are wealthy among us, including those of us that serve in the House of Representatives, cut services for everyone else, and then feel like they've set the country on the right track. Instead of spending our time debating the merits of the appropriations legislation before us, we're again trying to convince the majority to stick with the promises they made in the first place, rather than uniting in bipartisan fashion to support an open and transparent legislative process. Republicans are using partisan gimmickry to silence debate. Rather than debating this legislation under the Budget Control Act, we have to debate whether the Republican majority should even have to keep their promises. And rather than considering whether the inadequate levels of funding in this legislation, particularly in certain arenas, let me use one in the COPS program, that I thought it was wrong when Democrats cut that program, and I think it's wrong now that Republicans are talking about less money for a program that all of us know is desperately needed in our various communities. We have to consider doing more for struggling Americans, and we have to consider whether we ought to be cutting even more, as my colleagues would have it. I reserve the balance of my time.